But if you can't hear me, just kind of give me the high sign. This is pretty small, so I'll do a little bit of talking around the slides in case you really can't read it. But first I'd like to know, how many of you here have ever worked in a nonprofit? You could raise your hand. Okay. How many of you have ever donated to a nonprofit? Well, we're going to talk today about why that set of requests keeps coming over and over and over again, and what's starting to develop in the nonprofit world to try to respond to that need. I'm going to give you, start out with a few facts so you can get a sense of what's happening in the nonprofit sector here in Ohio, though what's happening in Ohio is pretty much mirrored by what's happening nationally. Then I'm going to give you a sense of why we need to talk about this thing called social enterprise, and I'll give you a number of examples about what it is. And hopefully you'll get a sense of why many of us who have been working in nonprofits are working very, very hard to try to develop this whole new approach to business in what we call our social sector. This first chart, which I bet you guys can't see if you're pretty far away, fundamentally is a survey that's done every year by an organization called the Nonprofit Finance Fund out of New York City, which I think is the thought leader in the nonprofit world. And they asked a question in 2013 and again in 2014. And they said, are people coming to you as a nonprofit asking you to do more than you did the year before? And in 2013, over 80% said yes, they want us to do more. And then when they asked this question again last year, it went up to 90%. Said, people are coming and saying, we need your help, we need more services, we need more hours, we need more centers. Well, then came the key question. And they asked them, well, do you have the resources in order to meet that increased demand for what you're doing? And the answer in 2013 was no. And in 2014 they said, we just don't have the resources to do it. Well, what's been the traditional response when you needed to do more as a nonprofit and you needed more resources? You send out a fundraising letter, right? Yep. You send out all those letters you get. But I'm going to put a chart up here that totally changed my mind about what the real problem is. This is a chart from what's called the IRS 990s, which is the tax return that a nonprofit has to send in every year. And I think it's the best source of information on what's really going on in a nonprofit. And this chart has charitable contributions as a share of nonprofit revenue. So it says how much of their budgets really are made up by these donations you're asking for. There's a couple of things that I think really jumps out when you look at this. First, I call this a flat line, don't you? It goes back to 1985. The second thing is, it's never been above 25%. The vast majority of nonprofit revenues come from selling goods or services through contract or through direct fees, no different than a for-profit business. Now, this does vary by sector, but the only sector of the nonprofit world that is majority supported by charitable contributions are just two. One is cultural institutions, and the second is K-12 education. Even the human services sector is primarily supported by selling goods or services to the government or to individuals. Now, if you're being asked to do more and you don't have the resources, and philanthropy is basically at capacity. Now, this isn't a story of selfishness. This is a story of doing as much as you can, because if we were having this conversation 20 years ago in the early 90s, we'd be saying most of the philanthropists today are in their late 60s and 70s. Are their kids going to carry the torch for them? And the answer is yes. So we've been able to maintain our generosity. But it's not going to go up. In fact, they just gave us 2 more years of data, and it actually went down 1.5%. So, how do nonprofits deal with this problem? Well, those that are what I call sustainable, that is, they're able to keep going all the time, and when a recession hits, they don't have to shut down or cut back their hours or deny clients. They really run as 2 businesses. Now, the first one is you're really familiar with, and it's actually a real challenge. A nonprofit, its key mission activity must lose money. Not because of a law, but we created these. They're 501c3s is the technical term. We created them because the market can't do what society needs to be done. So we created these tax exemption privileges saying, if you'll do these things that will lose money, we'll help you to get some ways to raise money from people through donations. And this worked for a long time, but it stopped working about 2000, 2001. But this is a real dilemma, because many nonprofits, particularly their boards, say, well, times are tough. You've got to break even on everything you do. Well, how do you break even? It means you take the easy clients, not the difficult clients. You take the popular hours, not the unpopular hours. You go into the better off neighborhoods rather than the really worse off neighborhoods. So it's really, really important that our nonprofits keep their focus on the fact that you've got to lose money on this if you're doing what you're supposed to do. But the reality is they're businesses, just like every other business. If you aren't profitable, you'll go bankrupt. In fact, there's nothing in the IRS code that says nonprofits shouldn't be profitable. In fact, they're assumed to be profitable. It's kind of unfortunate that we've chosen this term, nonprofits. Well, how do you deal with those 2 problems? You've got to do something that loses money, but you have to be profitable, and philanthropy is not going anywhere. It's not going to be the silver bullet. Well, the answer is those nonprofits that are sustainable do things that are very profitable. And that's what we call social enterprise. Social enterprise is a business that's run on totally familiar commercial principles, but it's run in order to have a social impact. There's basically 3 kinds of social enterprises. And I'll give you some examples later on, but probably the one that you're most familiar with is Zumbizi Bay. Zumbizi Bay is a water park. It actually is organized as a for-profit subsidiary of the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium. It pays taxes the same as all of your businesses pay taxes. But 100% of its profits are there to support the Columbus Zoo's conservation program, which is what they would call their key mission, not visiting the animals. And of course, you know they own the wilds out in Zanesville, which will never break even. In fact, it's the only facility in the Western Hemisphere for the preservation and propagation of endangered species. In the Western Hemisphere. Philanthropy is never going to be enough to support that. So that's the first kind, is you're running a profitable business so you can use those profits exclusively to support this mission charity. The second kind, which is becoming very much more common in our community, is a social enterprise where it runs to make money, but it has an expense structure that's very costly because of who they choose to employ. They choose to employ ex-felons. They choose to employ homeless people. They choose to employ people with development disabilities, or they choose to employ people on the autism spectrum. But other than that, they're run just like a business. What's the big difference? You're not going to have 30% profit margins if you're trying to employ people like that. And the third kind, which is not so common yet in our community, is you go into an area where the ability to generate revenue is going to be limited. Most of the efforts in our community now are in the area of trying to bring retail fresh produce into a food desert neighborhood, where you just know that you're not going to be able to sell the lettuce and the apples and all of that until you really kind of develop new habits and new practices and new familiarity. So, easy to say, how do you do it? Well, the first thing nonprofits do is they say, what's our core skill base? Now, this is an example of a social enterprise in Cincinnati called the Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance. And it started like many nonprofits do. They got a $16 million Department of Energy grant to do weatherization in impoverished neighborhoods. And that's how a lot of nonprofits started. I got a grant, so I'll form the nonprofit so I can do the work. But they were very forward-thinking because they said this grant runs out in 2013. Does that mean we should stop doing weatherization? It'll always be a need in a low-income community. So they said, well, what do? We're really good at inspecting buildings and knowing what needs to be done in order to make them more energy efficient. We are really good at putting together a core of pre-qualified contractors who know how to do the work at the right price in the right way. And we're really good at post-work inspections to make sure we got the energy efficiencies we wanted out of this project. Well, they said, whoop, they said, don't move ahead yet. If we can do this in a low-income community, we can do this in a higher-income community, which has the very same need, but needs the skills we provide. And that's what they did. They started providing it here to be profitable and used what they earned to be able to sustain this program after the grant program. But you're also familiar with this in the hospital world. I could talk about Ohio Health because it's really near you, but I'm going to talk about Mount Carmel. Everyone knows the Mount Carmel Health System. They have the New Albany Surgical Hospital. They have St. Anne's in Westerville. They have Mount Carmel East in, I believe, Gahanna. And they have Mount Carmel West, which is in Franklinton, which is a very impoverished neighborhood. New Albany is fairly prosperous. Westerville actually is now the wealthiest zip code in our region. That's the New Albany Surgical Hospital. What do you think the profit margin is at the New Albany Surgical Hospital? 31% in the last report. Why? All private pay, surgical, orthopedics, which is very profitable specialty. And they lose money in Franklinton. But that's why they did it. That's also why Ohio Health opened Dublin Methodist, so that it could support grant and its charitable contributions. What are some other ways? So one of the main ways a nonprofit can make money is they say, what do? And they say the only difference between making money and losing money is place, person, and price. Where I do it, for whom I do it, and what price I charge. And you've seen two examples of that. In order to talk about this and to help nonprofits really think about opportunities, I like to use this grid, which I call the Lincoln Mission to Money grid. Now the horizontal, and on this grid you put the various lines of business. And nonprofits are no different than for-profit businesses. Almost every business I've ever run into has multiple different lines of business or activities. And on the horizontal axis If it's profitable, it's on the right-hand side, and if it loses money, it's on the left-hand side. And in the for-profit world, while it's complex, it's fairly straightforward. If it's on the right-hand side, that's okay. If it's on the left-hand side, you sell, merge, or shut it down. But nonprofits have this more complicated vertical dimension they have to worry about, which is mission relevancy. Because remember, they were started to do something that had very high mission relevancy that needed to lose money. So indeed, we'll give an example of the Life Care Alliance, whose primary mission is Meals on Wheels. Meals on Wheels loses money. The reimbursements for fuel and food from the government no longer cover the cost of the program. And as you know, it's for low-income, homebound individuals. The Life Care Alliance said, if we are truly going to fulfill our mission and meet the need of everyone who makes a request, we must never have a waiting list. And that means that they're going to have much higher losses than they would have otherwise would. In fact, you should be proud of them. They are the only Meals on Wheels in the state of Ohio that does not have a waiting list.
Wow.
Well, how do they do that? Because you saw that fundraising isn't going to be above 25%. That's not going to pay all the bills. So what did they say? They said, what do we do? Well, we know logistics. We know how to deliver the right meal to the right person at the right address at the right time. We really know packaging. So hot stays hot and cold stays cold. And we know how to manage a kitchen to very tight nutritional standards because we have to meet minimum USDA nutritional standards. If we can do that in a package, we can do that in a steam table. We can do that to people who have higher incomes. And they actually started a higher income meal program for people who were able to pay but wanted or needed to have meals delivered to them at their home. A fairly mission-relevant activity, but done as a profit. They changed place, person, and price. But they didn't stop there. They said, if I can take it off-site to someone who can pay in a package, I can do it on a steam table. And moreover, I really want to provide good jobs for the people who work for me. And when the Meals on Wheels trucks leave at noon, we're done. And I want to give them a full-time job. What can I do in the afternoon with my skill base? And they said, I can start a corporate catering program called LA Catering. Not at all relevant to their mission. So they run it at a fairly good profit margin, precisely to take those profits to support their Meals on Wheels program. Now, Life Care Alliance is one of the most entrepreneurial nonprofits in town, so they didn't stop there. They said, if I can put a steam table in a truck, I could put a steam table in my own location. And by the way, there's a market there because most of my employees are brown bagging, and almost all of the employers in our vicinity, their people are brown bagging too. So they opened up a cafe. 3 profitable businesses with their core talents, so they would never have a waiting list for Meals on Wheels. That's what social enterprise is. 3 social enterprises. Yes?
What does that do to their 501c3 status?
Nothing. All the 501c3 requires is 2 things. That the bulk of your focus of your CEO and your board be spent on your mission. So for example, Zumbizi Bay has a separate head and a separate board. But it's 100% owned by the zoo, but the zoo CEO and the zoo board spend all of their time on key mission activities. The second thing is under the tax code, not the 501c3 code. It says how related to what you do in your mission is this profitable activity. If it's closely related, you don't pay taxes. If it isn't, but it's organized under 501c3, you pay unrelated business income tax, which is fairly common. And if it's totally unrelated, like the zoo, you just file corporate taxes like any organization. But it will not affect your 501c3 status. Now, if the head of the zoo spent all of his time running a water park, they'd say, why should we give you a break? You know? So you organize yourself in order to do it properly. Let me give you another example that's based on, hey, there's some people who can pay, why should we subsidize everybody? You know, and you've seen this in universities all your life, right? You have the full pay people and the scholarship people. So you have your tuition level and you have your average tuition that's paid, but if someone can afford the full ticket, why give them a scholarship? So the AIDS Resource Center Ohio runs, their main mission is to run a resource center. It's counseling, clinics, help people manage AIDS, loses money. So they noticed that people who came to their clinic and needed medications, they gave them a prescription, but it fell into two groups. Those that took that prescription and went to the next window and said, please give me my free medicine. But there was another group that took that prescription and walked over to CVS and Walgreens. And they said, why shouldn't we try to fill their prescriptions too? They have insurance. So they did what any new startup business does, is they said, is anyone else dealing with this? And they found in Wisconsin an organization that started its own for-profit pharmacy. And they did all the business planning. They looked at the neighborhoods. They evaluated their demand. They looked at their competitors. They saw what kind of capital do you need to get to this business up and running. And they basically raised their investment funds to start it. And they opened a pharmacy. Somewhat related to mission because of who they serve, but run at a profit to do that. After 24 months, that pharmacy is bringing in $1.5 million a year to supplement what philanthropy can't support. We could give you examples forever, but you don't have forever this morning. So, how do you get this going in our community? Because we really need more, and there are a fair number. One of our projects is to identify all of the operating social enterprises. We're up to 33 in our community, and I bet you don't know about any of them. Why? Do we write about them in our newspapers? Do we have economic development programs that are focusing on helping those businesses start, rather than just other kinds of businesses? It's just not on our radar screen. So what we found is, what needs to be done is the same thing we learned in high tech. You've got to have an outreach program so people know where to go. In our town, if you're starting a high tech business, who do you call? You call Tech Columbus. Tech Columbus ties you into skills you need to know, mentors, investors, training, people to be on your board, helps you recruit the people you need. You need some kind of training program called workshops. You need boot camps, which is that very intense 48-hour way in order to be able to see if your idea is viable rather than kind of struggling forever on something that's not going to make it. You need mentoring programs and pitch sessions. Now, we have a lot of these around the country, and separately we have investment funds. But they're not linked. And in fact, there is about $4 billion of investment capital going to social enterprises, but because we don't have an organized way to link startups to capital, 70% of all American capital raised for social enterprise goes abroad. 70% goes abroad because we don't have what we call a pipeline. You have to link these two things. You have to do both. So what we're doing in this town is we have now 2 social impact funds, the Columbus Foundation and the Tony Wells Foundation, who say there's no deal flow. So what we've done is we have formed the Center for Social Enterprise Development precisely to do for social enterprises what Tech Columbus does for high-tech institutions. How are we doing that? Well, we're doing outreach. So I come talk to groups like yourself to get this on your radar screen to let you know about it. We're actually putting together, as I mentioned earlier, a project with Otterbein University to identify the social enterprises here in town and to write up their profiles and really start some good publicity and PR so you can know about them. Wow, this is a business that does catering, but it has a social impact. If I give them my business, I'll not only help a business survive, but I'll make a difference in our community. We have workshops. We had one last week, February 10th. We have another one March 10th. And you can see the dates, April 16th, May 19th, and June 2nd. If you're a nonprofit and you want to get interested in it, go to our website and sign up for our workshops. If you know of a nonprofit you support that you think needs more money and needs to think about how to do it more than just fundraising, link them into us. We have a boot camp. We had one 2 weeks ago. It's very successful. We'll start a mentoring program in April. And what we also will do is we'll do practice pitch sessions, and we're looking to form an additional investment fund so accredited investors can participate in supporting these businesses too. So this is how you can contact us if you want to learn more about it. As Julie said, I have had a column in Business First for 8 years. It's once a month, all about these issues for nonprofits and social enterprises. I blog, I tweet, I do the whole thing. Gotta be young, right? Email me or telephone me. And I want to thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you'll want to get involved in social enterprise.